Hey guys, welcome to book review number 55. Today I'm going to be reviewing Apples, it says Apples right there, are from Kazakhstan by Christopher Robbins. Now, this is the first book that I've done by Christopher Robbins. It's also the first book that I've done that's exclusively about Kazakhstan. There are a couple other ones I've done where they go through Kazakhstan, like Murders in Mausoleums. But yeah, this book focuses exclusively on Kazakhstan. And he kind of hops around, Christopher kind of hops around to various areas. He starts the book kind of an introduction about how he got interested in Kazakhstan. In that he's from London and he was taking a flight into Moscow, and he met an American from Arkansas that actually found, I don't know if she was a wife, but an internet potential wife, I guess, not a mail order bride by any means, but someone that was from Almaty in Kazakhstan. And, you know, he had previously thought, what's the stereotypes about Kazakhstan? You got Borat, of course, which actually has nothing to do with Kazakhstan culture. And, you know, it's part of the ex-Soviet Union. Most people don't know much other than that. So this is where Chris kind of delves into it. And he starts out in Almaty, which is the historical capital of Kazakhstan and was the capital of Kazakhstan up until, let me get a map. It was moved to Astana in the north. But anyway, this area is kind of in the southeast. Very cold in the winter, just like all of Kazakhstan. Very steppe-like open plain. The difference being is that around Almaty, there are mountains that rise to the south, kind of around the city. So it's got a little bit less just kind of middle of nowhere vibe to it. A little bit less of that, even though it is kind of still in the middle of nowhere. At least you have mountains there. But really the more important thing that Chris does is he visits some of the historical or museums, or just kind of places of culture within Almaty that have obviously existed because it's the historical capital. You know, one being like an artifacts restorer that has taken these ancient civilizations and restored them. Now, it should be said about Kazakh ancient civilizations that it only became kind of a settled society with the invasion of the Russians in, like the Russian czars in, I want to say the mid-1800s, maybe even early 1800s. Yeah, I think that's right. Or at least started to be settled more heavily in the 1800s as a established community. Before that, it was a nomadic community made up of Kazakhs, those primarily being Muslim, but about as culturally different from Muslims in, say, Saudi Arabia as you can possibly get. You know, the Muslim world is actually quite diverse. Anyway, all these Orthodox Christians from Russia come in and they kind of brutally establish a settled society. And there's still to this day kind of some chauvinism among the Russians in Kazakhstan, make up a significant minority. You know, at one point they actually outnumbered Kazakhs, but now it's like 40% Russian, 50% Kazakh, 10% everything else. Whoa, hold on, you guys. I'm gonna have to plug this back in. Yeah, but anyway, the Russians have a little bit of a superiority complex because of, you know, their bringing of quote-unquote civilization, much like, you know, we had about the Native Americans when we brought civilization to them. This is being the United States of America. But let's see, what else? So yeah, like a lot of these artifacts that this guy is restoring are kind of the only ruins that are left, because individual pieces of pottery or like body armor or weapons stick around, but when you're a nomad, like your horses don't, your tents don't. So unlike, say, like Chinese civilization where they have all these ancient ruins, there's really not a lot of that exists on the Kazakhstan plain from like a more architectural perspective. And then Chris goes out into the countryside and sees, the apples from, I think it's just kind of around Almaty, which they're very famous for. Very large apples that ruled the Soviet Union, like this big. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, fell out of favor for the world global market and apples from the West, wherever they were from, Chile or, wherever. But in recent times, there's actually been a small revival of apples from there. And I'd actually like to try an apple from Kazakhstan if I ever get the opportunity, which I probably won't because you have to be in Asia and be in that part. You can't have an apple from Kazakhstan shipped halfway around the world. It's just unfeasible. That being said, what does he do next? I think from there he goes to like this famous gorge near the Chinese border called Charin Gorge. He says it's sort of like the Grand Canyon, but unlike the Grand Canyon, now this is a little bit further to the north, so there aren't really a lot of mountains around. It's kind of in the steppe, but the gorge like drops off kind of from the steppe, so it's almost like you can't see it, 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 and then you're there, and there's a big drop off. And he says it's very beautiful, just like the Grand Canyon in Arizona, except maybe a little less tourist because, obviously it's much more remote than the Grand Canyon, which everyone and their brother goes to. Next, he goes up to Astana, which is the new capital of Kazakhstan. And this is actually, I think, where the book really takes off because it's where he, fortunately, meets the president of Kazakhstan. And actually, after a little bit of wrangling, gets pretty untruced access to him. And travels around with the president. I think the president's name is Nabirov or something. Yeah, something like that. But anyway, what this really provides him is an ability to travel with the president and his personal aircrafts around the country. First, they go to, first of all, I should say, Astana is a capital that was just established. It was really a small town up until about the mid-1990s when it was established as the new capital of Kazakhstan, much like, in Myanmar, I forget what the new capital is, but how that's moved out of Yangon to the new capital, or Brasilia is the new capital of Brazil, moving out of, I think it was Sao Paulo. But anyway, they established this new capital in one of the coldest places on Earth in this, I wouldn't say Russian steppe, but it's not Russian, in this, cold, near Siberian steppe environment. But with a lot of the oil wealth and kind of new mineral wealth that's coming into the country, the government is actually able to build some really beautiful buildings there, including like a worship center for all faiths, or a faith tolerance center, I guess you would call it. A new parliament building, new presidential palace, all that stuff. Now, Christopher says that there isn't necessarily a lot of life in these places because, you just need to be somewhere for a while for some life to exist. But that he sees clearly a foothold has been built to make this the capital. And despite the struggles in the first few years when there weren't enough apartment blocks for all the governmental employees, that even though the history isn't long and it doesn't really feel established yet, that that trajectory will be there and will be strong, is essentially what Chris says, in that these buildings will eventually gain character as more and more people move in and out as time passes. So anyway, he goes with the president, and I still want to get that guy's name. Oh, there was Naburev. Anyway, he goes with him to the Aral Sea region, which is, if you know anything about the Aral Sea, was part of a big, back when Kazakhstan was part of the Soviet Union and Uzbekistan, was part of a big cotton growing push and collectivization. that was successful for a while, but essentially used up all of the fresh water out of the two major feeder rivers to the Aral Sea, the Amu Daryan and the Amu Dara and Sirdara, which essentially led to the drying up of the Aral Sea. I think the Aral Sea has like 15% of the surface area that it had in like the 1960s or 70s, or like 60s, I think. So anyway, it's basically a huge ecological disaster. There's also a ton of like pesticides and fertilizers that have completely like decimated the soil there. It's become very saline because of the lack of water that's replenishing the Aral Sea. The salt in the sea becomes more concentrated, and then when the sea evaporates, all that's left is salt, and that blows all over the land and creates, huge salt pans, which are obviously destroy agriculture, the very opposite of what the Soviet Union was looking to do. Anyway, they got a plan to kind of dam the part of the Aral Sea so that part of it can come back and be reestablished. Sorry, there's another group over there, it seems. But anyway, next he goes to, Turkestan and visits, some of the ancient capitals. That's pretty cool. He goes and sees a cow being slaughtered, or I think it might have been like a sheep, in a very traditional kind of meal. Him being given the sheep head. People are talking over me. Him being given the sheep head, which he's kind of squeamish about, but takes a few bites out of the cheek. Enjoys it a little bit. Luckily doesn't have to eat the eyeball. But then he goes on to kind of back up to Astasia and talks about the history of Karaguna, which is the gulag place of the Soviet Union, which sorry, you guys, where the gulag was in the Soviet Union, and kind of the depravity there. Now, the person that wrote, I want to say his name's Samirov or something, the guy that wrote Gulag Archipelago, which is the seminal and probably most important book about the gulags. The gulags being the Russian prison camps that the Soviet Union used to scare not only legitimate political prisoners, but scare everybody into acting the way that they wanted them to, kind of as a means of punishment. And they were brutal. Constant starvation, never enough heat, never enough clothing, overworking. Really, the Soviets worked people to death more than just killed them like the Nazis did. But anyway, there was a huge cement plant, I want to say, in this region, and steel plant, I think, which kind of looked like hell. Steel, you got to get it really hot, and it's like molten lead and stuff all over the place. And he kind of talks also about the Samia region up in the northeast, which was the site of all the Soviet Union nuclear tests, and how there were I want to say 200 nukes that went off in this area around the Irtysh River, and how they would use humans in the blast radius and then study the effect of the radiation on the person's body in order to see what the test was like, which is pretty sick, anti-humanistic. He also talked about how in the same city of Semi, which used to be Semipalatinsk, back in the Tsarist days. Now, this is before the gulags, before the Soviets, but actually when there was a Tsar or a king or an emperor of Russia, how Dostoevsky was sent there and actually wrote his second famous book called The House of the Dead, about the people and the prisons in this region, and became very famous for it. He also talked about the woman that would eventually marry Dostoevsky, and how she was kind of a wild girl, but also, very kind of schizophrenic, but also very smart. So kind of just the trials and tribulations of the very melancholy, very torpid Dostoevsky, kind of living this existential horror of, in the remote regions of Kazakhstan. And of course, he eventually went back to Moscow and became very famous for his later novels. But this had a profound influence on him for the rest of his life, not only for his wife, but just kind of what he saw in the region. He did mention, though, that because all the intellectuals, and this happened under the Soviets and under the Tsars, because all the intellectuals were sent out to these remote regions, that the one kind of redeeming factor was that you were among fellow intellectuals, so you could, even though you were dealing with kind of crass baseline labor, you could deal with these people. Your one redeeming fact was the fact that you were interacting with intellectuals. Let's see, what else does he talk about? I know he talks about some of the lakes. I already mentioned the Aral Sea. Obviously, kind of the dominating geographical features are, these steppes, which are good for both kind of nomadic tribes more in earlier history, as well as the cruelty of Soviets. I guess I'll mention this one story he told. I'll make this the last one. There's only been one Englishman. Well, there's been more than one Englishman, but kind of one of the first Englishmen that went to Kazakhstan, went right in the middle of the wintertime, and talked about the kind of almost insane or just very daring, kind of Byronistic guy who, when it was like minus 20 degrees or 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the dead of winter in Kazakhstan, decided to try to ride a donkey across the entire country, and talked about his trials and tribulations, and how he was almost killed if not for the Cossacks who settled the region. The Cossacks being the vanguards of, the Soviet, or the Tsarists, and then later, well, not really the Soviets, because the Soviets didn't like the Kazakhs, but particularly the Tsarists, for the conquest of these eastern regions of Russia, Asiatic Russia. And of course, real quick mention, oil wealth, which obviously exists, nuclear, which I already mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to tell even more stories. He mentions that, Kazakhstan is primarily a Muslim country, as I mentioned, like over 50%, with, a smattering of Eastern Orthodox. But, a lot of these people in the United States are afraid of the terrorists and afraid of the Muslims, and afraid of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of Muslims. Well, this is a great counterexample to the fear-mongering and extremism that exists against Muslims in the Western world, in that right now the only Muslim-dominated country that has nuclear weapons is Pakistan in their standoff with India. But actually, I think that's right. But actually, there were weapons in Kazakhstan once it became an independent country from the Soviet Union. And this mostly Muslim country had the option to sell these nuclear weapons to more nefarious Islamic neighbors, such as Iran, Iraq. Iran's the big one, that are all looking for nuclear weapons, and we don't know necessarily if they, they're kind of crazy countries. We don't want nuclear weapons falling in their hands. But the Kazakhstan government, specifically under this Nabarov, if I can get his name right, there it is, I saw it. Yeah, Nazarbayev, Nazarbayev, who's been the president since the early 1990s. Which, there's some controversy about that, because he's not put a term limit on how long he can be president. He's ruled the entire time, which a lot of Western democracies have poo-pooed. But despite that fact, he's been very benevolent, been very fair, brought in a lot of not only financial investment, but made slow progress towards democracy, albeit that not 100%, bows and ribbons, United States, United Kingdom, France, Western democracy, but certainly steps in a country that was under pure chaos under the Soviets. But anyway, he decides to bring the United States in because the Soviet Union, or Russia, which is pretty much broke at this point, doesn't want to deal with these weapons. So he brings in the United States, and actually the first joint venture between the United States and Kazakhstan is the disarming of the nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan, to the point where now there are no nuclear weapons there, and the threat for a loose nuke to fall into the wrong hands is non-existent. One more thing about Nazarbayev, which I thought was interesting, was, and I promise I'll make this the last one, is that when the Soviet Union broke up, Kazakhstan was like the country that had the longest historical ties to Russia, and a lot of people were speculating that would remain part of Russia. And Russia actually tried to have great influence over Kazakhstan by having a single monetary system, rubles for both countries, having one central bank, having a lot of just the policies of the country set by Russia. But what Kazakhstan did is they super secret, in the face of the Russians, overnight established their own currency and just kind of like ninja currency in the new country, which allowed them to be independent, which was a great gamble on Nazarbayev's part, not only because it would piss off the Russians, but because of the chance of economic collapse in introducing a currency this quickly. But in any case, yeah, it was a good book. I'm running on 20 minutes. Apples are from Kazakhstan. Okay, so some general analysis. Very straightforward, very clear-headed, not any kind of mumbo-jumbo. I don't think it was a propaganda piece, even though he spent a lot of time with the presidency. It was very fair, but very firm. Covered a lot of different regions, covered a lot of different issues, covered a lot of different time periods. Yeah, and it was just a very generally good book. Kind of very informative, not the easiest read, but not a difficult to read by any means. Very accessible. So yeah, Apples Are from Kazakhstan by Christopher Robbins. I would recommend it. Check it out if you want to know anything about the country that isn't black. Thank you very much. If you want to actually be not a dumb American or a dumb international person, if you're watching this from somewhere else, read this book. It's good. Kazakhstan's going to be an important player in the future of the world. So anyway, see you guys. Bye.